You're watching the RNL, the Revolution Nothing Less show. Today is August 13th, 2020. My name is Sansara Taylor. I'm one of the hosts of the show. I have got this gorgeous mask, and I'm here with the masked man, Andy Z, also a host of our show. And we want to say thank you to the viewer who sent these to us. You can add to that.
We really were thrilled that somebody who's been a longtime watcher of the show handmade these great masks and sent them to the whole crew. And it means a lot to us when we get things like that, especially when people give us their comments and their feedback. Today, Sansara, we have a really important show. It's a special show. It's a unique show because we're focusing on a very critical and historic statement from the revolutionary leader, Bob Avakian, on the immediate critical situation, the urgent need to drive out the fascist Trump-Pence regime, voting in this election, and the fundamental need for revolution. I think the title speaks for itself. This is extremely important. We're at a juncture in world history, American history right now, of where this Trump-Pence regime is attempting to hold on to power and consolidating fascism, which has real meaning in this period. But if you look at the last part of the title, the fundamental need for revolution, that speaks to what our show is all about. Revolution, nothing less. And for our new viewers, I'm going to be explaining this briefly today, but if you watch past episodes and in the future episodes, we'll be going more into revolution and actual revolution and what it's about and what it's for and why it's necessary. All of this is a big part and is the main reason we're here. But if you look out at the world today and you see the potential devastation and even destruction of the environment, making it not habitable for humanity, if you think about the danger of nuclear war and Trump who says if we have nuclear weapons, why can't we use them? You think about black lives and brown lives and the police murder and oppression of black and brown people in this country, the white supremacy that's woven into it from its foundation. If you think about the degradation of women and the oppression of women here and around the world, and the LGBTQ people who are oppressed here and around the world, and especially in this country, and are now beginning to potentially lose the rights that have been won. And if you think about the demonization and deportation of immigrants and the literal life-killing things that are happening at the border of the U.S. as well as in the Mediterranean. These are all problems of the system that cannot be reformed. The system depends on these things. They cannot get rid of it. And this is part of the basis for an actual revolution. We call these things the 5 stops, 5 things that people care very deeply about that cannot be reformed. And because of that, and that millions of people care about these things, there is the basis for an actual revolution, and that people need to act on that. And we actually have a way to get free of this that's concentrated in the work and of Bob Avakian and in his leadership, who's, there's no other thinker or political leader like this. He's the most important thinker and leader in the world today because he's been working on these problems and how humanity could get free from them. And on the basis of years of work, decades of work, he's come to the scientific conclusion that only an actual revolution to overthrow this system, which has a name, capitalism, imperialism, can humanity begin to get on the road to actual emancipation. And that actual emancipation requires a plan, a blueprint, and Bob Avakian has written that blueprint in the Constitution for a new socialist republic in North America. It's an extraordinary document. You can find it on revcom.us. Revcom.us is the website that we produce this show in association with. We'll be constantly telling you to go to that website to find out what we're talking about in even greater depth. And as I said, this is a show about a movement for an actual revolution, and we feature the activity of the RevComs, which are the people who work with the revolution clubs around the country to get organized for the time when you could actually make a revolution in this country. So I think, there's more to say about that, but for today, I want to leave it at that so we can get into this statement from Bob Avakian and the critical importance and urgency of what we face. So maybe before we go right there, you could tell people about what to expect in today's episode of the RNL show.
Yeah, so today's episode, as Andy said, is going to pivot on this new historic statement from Bob Avakian. And like the show overall, we're inviting you into this movement for revolution. We're inviting you in, and there's no better way to enter into this right now than to engage this statement. We're going to start out with Andy sharing some of the meat of it, but not all of it, but he'll explain that in our first segment. We're going to give you a roundup of some of the beginning impact this statement had right when it came out, from howling fascist lunatics attacking it to people more thoughtfully engaging it. And this needs to go much further to, the played out, tired, crusty, unprincipled so-called left's dismissal and fascist denialism. We'll share some of that. Luan will join me for some of that. We're going to also bring you a segment that was produced by our RNL team on some of the fascist fuckery in relation to this upcoming election. It's very heavy. I won't say more. You'll see it in a few minutes. And two other things we have is a call that's been put out by Refuse Fascism for major protests September 5th, acting on the emergency that we face, rallying and seeking to rally tens of thousands or more to stand up and raise the demand the Trump-Pence regime must go now. A very important day of action that people should get involved in. And finally, there will be an exchange between Andy, not actually in this order, but there will also be an exchange between Andy and a progressive Reverend Bob Brashear with his thoughts on this moment, keying off of and engaging this statement from BA. So all of it does pivot around that. I think without any further ado, we should dive right in and go to the segment where Andy opens this up.
Okay, let's go. On August 1st, 2020, Bob Avakian, BA, issued a major statement of tremendous importance. In fact, the future depends on masses of people taking in its basic message, engaging it, and then acting on what it calls for. BA lays out the themes and the urgent content of the statement in its title. On the immediate critical situation, the urgent need to drive out the fascist Trump-Pence regime, voting in this election, and the fundamental need for revolution. There is a lot packed into this title, all four parts of it, but note well the immediate and critical urgency of what we face. Today's program is going to go into these themes, these crucial points. We are fortunate that Bob Avakian made an audio reading of his statement, and I'm going to be playing excerpts to provide us with a basic view of the depth and the strategic orientation that he provides. There is tremendous depth, as I said, complexity, nuance, and dialectics, which means relationships to this piece. You really do have to read and listen to the whole thing, and do so more than once. If you don't, you're not being serious, nor are you fully confronting the grave danger that humanity faces from this regime. And in this introduction, I will set the stage for our full program today and for your deeper engagement with the statement, which you can find at our website, www.revcom.us. But let's begin with listening to how Bob Avakian puts the challenge to the people, to how he captures the stakes for all of us.
Right now, for everyone who is concerned with ending injustice and oppression, and with the question of whether humanity will have a future worth living, or will have a future at all, removing the Trump-Pence fascist regime from power is an immediate, urgent question and truly historic imperative. And for those who understand the need for revolution, for the overthrow of this system as the fundamental solution to the continuing horrors this system causes for the masses of humanity, whether this system is ruled through an open fascist dictatorship or the disguised democratic dictatorship of the ruling capitalist class. The immediate struggle to oust the Trump-Pence regime from power must be approached not as a diversion from or substitute for building the movement for the revolution that is needed, but precisely as part a crucial part and urgent requirement of the overall work of building for this revolution. Our fundamental goal and guiding star remains revolution, nothing less.
BA continues the statement saying, in everything we do, including in all the struggles we take part in that are themselves short of revolution, our consistent approach is and must be to make all this serve that fundamental goal of revolution and the emancipation of humanity. And then BA concludes part one, which is the introduction to the full statement, with this.
Normally, we revolutionary communists argue that people should not vote in bourgeois elections, which serve to reinforce the existing system of capitalism, imperialism, and feed popular illusions that exploitation, oppression, and injustices can somehow be reformed away, short of getting rid of the system that gives rise to these horrors in the first place. But is this the right position to take in relation to this particular election? To answer this, we need to look at the whole picture.
BA presents a devastating picture of what the Trump-Pence regime has done and where it is headed. And here I will just say that concentration camps on the border and paramilitary forces deployed to suppress protests should be reason enough to recognize this fascism and oppose it. But the full picture of this regime's fascist assaults on humanity is something that no one should become used to, a cost that is measured in countless lives that are already lost. BA says in his statement,
but as horrific as all this has been, it is not just a matter of horrific policies, but of a qualitatively different form of rule, based on brutal repression and violation of what are supposed to be the most basic rights. If this regime is able to further consolidate its power and make further leaps in implementing its horrific objectives, this will result in a devastating setback for any attempt to resist injustice and oppression, and will very likely lead to the brutal repression and even annihilation of defenders of democratic rights and proponents of any meaningful progressive reforms, as well as any organized forces fighting for fundamental revolutionary change.
Let me repeat. This will result in a devastating setback for any attempt to resist injustice and oppression, and will very likely lead to the brutal repression and even annihilation of defenders of democratic rights and proponents of any meaningful progressive reforms, as well as any organized forces fighting for fundamental revolutionary change. Take that in and go and read and or listen to the full argumentation at revcom.us. I want to go now to a segment that the RNL Revolution Nothing Less crew has prepared on how, in the context of the November 2020 presidential election, the Trump-Pence regime is actively preparing and setting the stage for a serious confrontation over the consolidation of fascism in their fight to stay in power. And after that segment, I will have more to say about the historic statement from Bob Avakian.
The 2020 presidential elections will not be normal elections. In fact, they will be like none other in recent times. They will be a focal point in the struggle over whether the U.S. is going to become a fascist country. And what people do in this complex situation will matter greatly.
There is a tradition in this country, in fact, one of the prides of this country is the peaceful transition of power, and that no matter how hard fought a campaign is, that at the end of the campaign, that the loser concedes to the winner, not saying that you're necessarily going to be the loser or the winner, but that the loser concedes to the winner and that the country comes together in part for the good of the country. Are you saying you're not prepared now to commit to that principle?
What I'm saying is that I will tell you at the time. I'll keep you in suspense.
Well,
okay?
Chris,
Can you give a direct answer? You will accept the
I
election?
have to see. Look, I have to see. No, I'm not going to just say yes. I'm not going to say no. And I didn't last time either.
Since June of this year, groups of politicians, academics, and military officials have been quietly meeting to run simulations and game out scenarios. What if President Trump refuses to concede a loss, as he publicly hinted he might do? How far could he go to preserve his power? Diverse voices in the US are expressing concern that the Trump-Pence regime has no intention of leaving office, regardless of the results of the election. And these fears are justified. Not only has Trump repeatedly tweeted in opposition to the whole idea of using mail-in ballots, he has also floated the idea of postponing the elections altogether. Trump and the Republicans are doing everything they can to cheat and steal the election, suppressing voters who are likely to vote against Trump, and at the same time delegitimizing the election beforehand, claiming in advance that the process is rigged. Then, if they lose, they can try to hold onto power while contesting or denying the results. In the name of preventing voter fraud, states are passing laws that restrict what does and doesn't qualify as proper identification for voting. Texas passed a law that specified that a gun license could be used as voter ID, but a state university ID could not. On its face, it seems neutral and pointless, but once you find out that 80% of gun licenses are issued to white people, while 50% of state university students are people of color, the point of voter ID laws like this become clear. In May of 2020, the New York Times reported that the Republican Party had launched a $20 million campaign to recruit up to 50,000 poll watchers to challenge ballots and voters deemed suspicious. If you look at what these fascists are actually saying and doing, it becomes clear that what they mean by suspicious is people of color, and what they mean by monitor is intimidate. Listen to this audio of voter suppression activists at a February strategy session that included the organization True the Vote, a group that lobbies for tougher restrictions on voting.
Do you want to go into an inner city precinct or a tribal precinct and be the Republican there to oversee things? I mean, that is not a comfortable place to be, and that's where this fraud happens.
You want to talk about people who understand and respect law and order and chain of command. You get some SEALs in those polls, and they're going to say, no, this is what it says, and this is how we're going to play this show, and that's what we need.
After the conference, True the Vote launched its Continue to Serve website, specifically to sign up ex-cops and ex-military. Think about that. Ex-cops and ex-military. Ex-cops and ex-military. In the wake of the police murdering George Floyd and racist vigilantes murdering Ahmaud Arbery, imagine the impact on Latinos, whether immigrants or not, of poll watchers demanding, "Show me your papers." This Republi-fascist push for poll watchers is aimed at nothing less than scaring black and brown people away from polling places. At the same time, fascist forces led by Trump are launching an all-out assault on the legitimacy and integrity of this election if they are not successful in these efforts to engineer an electoral win. The way they are doing this is by claiming in advance that the election is rigged. Trump has led the charge on this by attacking mail-in or absentee voting, which is going to be much more common this year due to the pandemic. Various researchers have put forward that mail-in voting is a virtually fraud-proof method, already widely used throughout the US, especially by seniors, rural people, and those in the military, constituencies that usually lean Republican. But now that this will be increasingly needed and used by Black, Latino, and Native people, it's become a target for the fascists. On May 24th, Trump tweeted, "The United States cannot have all mail-in ballots. It will be the greatest rigged election in history." 4 days later, it was, "Mail-in voting will lead to massive fraud and abuse. It will also lead to the end of our great Republican Party." Through cutting funding and hours for the Postal Service, the Trump-Pence regime is hobbling the ability of the Postal Service to function ahead of an election where its services are vital. He is working to create a self-fulfilling prophecy meant to sow doubt and confusion around the results. Looking forward to Election Day, given what Trump has already said and done, consider how things could play out if Trump loses the election. His supporters, including the armed ones, the tough people, and the bikers for Trump, could be mobilized and pour into the streets to defend him, perhaps backed or even led by the rapid deployment forces he has created. As Bob Avakian recently emphasized,
Trump is not only seeking to suppress the votes of people who will vote against him, but is also preparing to utilize forceful, violent repression to remain in office if he is not declared the winner in the election.
this, together with the likely confusion created by the pandemic and a massive increase in mail-in voting, could provide the basis for the regime to dig in. All of this is very dangerous and needs to be opposed as part of the movement to drive out this regime now.
Trump is out now! Right now! Right now! Right now! Right now! Right now! Right now!
So that should give you a sense of the serious and grave danger for how the Trump-Pence regime is preparing for a full-bore fascist approach to not just holding onto power, but bludgeoning into place a fascist America. And before that great film segment, we left off with an important point from Bob Avakian, that all the regime has done and what they are bringing now will, quote, result in a devastating setback for any attempt to resist injustice and oppression, and will very likely lead to the brutal repression and even the annihilation of defenders of democratic rights and proponents of any meaningful progressive reforms, as well as any organized forces fighting for fundamental revolutionary change. So after this, as the statement goes on, Bob Avakian poses sharply the overwhelming need to mobilize mass, determined, sustained, nonviolent protest to oust this regime. He poses the near certain disaster that would result from simply relying on elections. But then he goes into why and how.
At this critical hour, every appropriate means of nonviolent action must be utilized to remove this regime from power. And if, in spite of mass protest demanding the removal of the Trump-Pence regime, this regime remains in power when it is time for voting, then, without placing fundamental reliance on this, using all appropriate means to work for the removal of this regime must include voting against Trump, assuming the election is actually held. To be clear, this means not a protest vote for some candidate who has no chance of winning, but actually voting for the Democratic Party candidate Biden in order to effectively vote against Trump.
What is concentrated in BA's statement is a profound and strategic analysis of how to understand the role of voting in this election. why it will be disastrous if we rely on voting without a mass mobilization in the event that Trump refuses to leave office, or even if he does. Why and how, in the situation where there is an election, voting against Trump can contribute to the struggle to drive the regime from power. This is not a matter of voting for the lesser of two evils, but of defeating a fascist future.
To approach this election from the standpoint of which candidate is better means failing to understand the truly profound stakes and potential consequences of what is involved. The fact is that there can be one and only one good that can come out of this election: delivering a decisive defeat to Trump and the whole fascist regime. Doing this would create far better conditions for continuing to wage the struggle against everything represented by the Trump-Pence regime and all the oppression and injustices of this system, and would be a great gift to the people of the world.
BA goes on then to discuss in still greater depth the relationship between voting and the need for a determined nonviolent struggle against the fascist Trump-Pence regime, drawing important historical reference to Nazi Germany. Digging down deeper, Bob Avakian returns to a critical point of orientation he has been stressing over the last several months, that there will not be, and no one should want to, return to the normalcy of this system, which ruthlessly exploits and oppresses people here and around the world and is woven through and through with white supremacy. Bob Avakian sharply and unequivocally makes the point that, quote, no fundamental change for the better can come under this system, end quote. And he concludes the statement with this.
In summation, given the truly monumental stakes involved, not only in terms of any particular issue, no matter how important, and not merely in terms of this country, but for the masses of people throughout the world and the future of humanity, there is a great need to approach things and act with the sophistication necessary to handle the complex and difficult contradictions involved in all this. Having a broad vision, rejecting petty sectarianism and brittle dogmatism, and not falling into a paralyzing either-or. Either we fight against white supremacy and police terror, or we fight to bring about the removal of the Trump-Pence fascist regime. Either we vote in this election, or we build mass struggle against outrageous oppression and against this fascist regime. Either we oppose this regime by all appropriate means, or we work for revolution. In this extraordinary and very complex situation, and from the point of view of advancing the struggle toward the goal of finally eliminating all exploitation and oppression everywhere, there is an urgent need to do all of that, and to do so with an understanding of the correct and necessary relation between the different parts of this overall approach, putting the main emphasis and reliance on mass mobilization, with voting in this extraordinary situation necessary and important, but not the main thing to be relied upon. And in fundamental terms, making all this contribute to creating more favorable conditions for and building up the organized forces for not only resisting the crimes of this system, but finally carrying out the revolution that is needed in order to put an end to this monstrously criminal system and its domination in the world in any form.
So with this as just an introduction to Bob Avakian's full statement, in this episode we're going to get into some initial responses to this statement. And we're going to bring you refusefascism.org's call for protest on September 5th, which is kicking off the kind of mass struggle that Bob Avakian is calling for. What you have just heard and the entirety of today's program should provoke you to not only reflect on the fascism we face, but fill you with responsibility to act on what BA has called for. And the place to start is to read and listen to the full statement at revcom.us, and then post it far and wide. Wield it and kick up a big debate and a storm so that the challenge of driving out the fascist Trump-Pence regime from power is decisively met, opening up the potential for a fight for a whole new world.
So I'm here in the studio with Luan, and we want to share a bit of the beginning response to this statement from BA that Andy was just telling you about. And look, this statement has been released at a major juncture in human history. I hope that's clear by now, but every force in society is lining up on one side or the other, from all the different streams of fascism lining up behind this regime, fighting to consolidate and make advances through this election season, to many forces from different perspectives who are against this fascism, as well as many who objectively are not with it, but they're also in denial and letting it advance. And so this statement, because it speaks so incisively to this moment, to the stakes, to what's going on, and to what must be done, it can have an enormous impact on the side of the people to wake up and confront this and act in the ways that are needed. And we're beginning to see already in the initial responses a glimpse of this statement's potential power, with very deep and divergent responses from really all different sections of people. So Luan is going to start us off with some of that.
So one thing that we saw is a lot of these different fascist forces that support Trump really went after this statement immediately. There was an article that was put out by the Washington Times, which is a right-wing publication. There was articles put out on Breitbart and Fox News. Donald Trump Jr. actually retweeted some of these articles. And we also saw an official statement from Trump's official campaign putting out a press statement against this article. And this is very serious, and it shows that it's clear that they see an opportunity in this to go after Biden, to portray him as a tool for what they dubbed far-left communists, as well as the reality is they're showing that they're going to go after all opposition to their regime. And we just want to go back to and look, they've said that they see in Trump their last chance to impose their whole fascist program. And this is reflected how they really went after this statement that Bob Avakian recently put out.
Yeah, and I think it's worth noting too that these fascists, very serious, I agree with you. They also brought more attention to this statement, and this is something that made other people pay more mind to it. We have to build on that. I want to take note there were a number of more mainstream liberal journalists, some of whom have spent a lot of time sounding the alarm on the rising fascism in this country, who responded to this as well. I wanted to read a couple of responses. One tweeted out, "Holy shit, Bob Avakian has endorsed Joe Biden." And they sent out a link to the statement from Bob Avakian. Another one wrote, "You can't vote to defeat Trump unless you also vote for Joe Biden. Chomsky can say it, Brother West can say it, even Bob Avakian can say it." So while these don't say as much and they're not as deep an engagement as we need among different sections, they are responding and, again, entering into this debate that needs to happen. There were a number of much more substantive responses of various kinds as well, including from people who are very concerned of different kinds. We've published quite a few of these at revcom.us. Luan picked a few that we wanted to share with you here.
So the first one I'm going to read is from a filmmaker, documentarian, and they said, when the RCP actually calls for people to vote, you know the situation is really, really bad. I've always admired the intellectual tenacity of Bob Avakian. His social and geopolitical analysis are always on target. The next is from a retired supervisor in a prominent black church, and they said, my goodness, yes, Bob Avakian went all out with that. He is a very clear thinker, and we should move ahead with this message. You hear people now saying terroristic, fascistic. It is used more freely. Dictatorship, Nazis. This is openly being said. Trump is undermining the democratic system. These are all common statements now. But Bob Avakian and Refuse Fascism have been saying it from the beginning. Bob Avakian talks about the unprecedented times that we're in, and Avakian warns of the dangers, but it is more than even I expected, and it intensifies by the day. Then Trump calls for possibly not having elections. That is the extreme end of it. The next is from, or the last one I'm going to read, is from a member of the clergy who's been involved in Refuse Fascism. And they said, BA's statement is very clear, and what I hear BA saying is that the situation is so dire, we need to take whatever measures we can to get back to some kind of normal, to get to creating a revolutionary situation, and that fascist Trump consolidating is not just a threat to revolution, but to the human race as a whole. This speaks very well of Avakian, and he is putting the well-being of human beings first.
So in reflecting on some of these statements, and again, there are more at revcom.us, there's a lot revealed. There's a lot to learn from these and what people are seeing in the moment, in the appreciation they're showing for the clarity of BA's analysis and thinking here, and in the sounding of the alarm. So I think it does reveal a lot of the potential if this statement was to get out much, much more broadly to bring this kind of clarity to many more people who are agonizing and searching for a direction right now. Having said that, in reflecting on this, we were both struck that among not just these, but others on the website and others we've talked to, there among those who are responding to the alarm and the sense of emergency and appreciating that, there is, and rightly so, a lot of note being given to the fact that the situation is so extreme that BA is including the need to vote for Biden, to vote against Trump as a response. But there's less commenting and dealing with the emphasis BA puts on not relying on these elections and really mobilizing all out in the streets to confront this. So this underscores the importance of a segment that we'll have a little later in the episode, actually, on the protest being called by refusefascism.org this September 5th to demand Trump Pence out now, and for us all to be mobilizing for that. So we'll return to that a little bit later.
Finally, there was a wave of responses that ranged from fascism denialism to fascism denialism paired with intellectual and ideological dishonesty and idiotic snark. And some of these people argued that rather than waiting till it got to this point and voting for Biden, BA and the RCP should have gotten involved in the election sooner and backed Sanders. And as a part of the showing and dragging the Democratic Party more to the left and showing the media that the working class is more radical than they're portrayed. And this kind of argument is way off the mark. And in the statement that Avakian has actually written, that they're claiming to be critiquing, Avakian writes this: to approach this election from the standpoint of which candidate is better means failing to understand the profound stakes and potential consequences of what is involved. The fact is that there is one and only one good that can come out of this election: delivering a decisive defeat to Trump and the whole fascist regime. Doing this would create far better conditions for continuing to wage the struggle against everything represented by the Trump-Pence regime and all the oppression and injustices of this system, and would be a great gift to the people of the world, end quote. The point is precisely not to rely on the normal workings of the system and through elections on their own terms, and this includes any kind of notion of dragging the Democratic Party more to the left. It's not about voting in who's going to be a more liberal candidate. The point that's actually being made is the need for a massive struggle that's actually required to drive out this fascist regime, and dealing a decisive blow to Trump through the elections can drastically contribute to the massive struggle that's needed.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And, most of the rest of these so-called left responses were so low level that Luan and I didn't even feel they merited a response so much as a scolding. I mean, some of them, including one of the main editors of the Jacobin publication, didn't even engage BA's own words. Instead, they spread and snarked about a fascist publication's distortion of what BA said. This is intellectual bankruptcy, this is dishonesty, this is destructive, and it's in the service of fascism denialism. which is every bit as dangerous to humanity as climate change denialism, straight up. But for everybody who does care about humanity and its future, who is agonizing about what's going on every day, the mounting fascism that we see in the streets, in the halls of power, in the courts, all of this, who's wondering what needs to be done and is there anything that can be done. There's nothing more important to engage, to dig into, and to spread and to talk with others about than this statement from BA. It is providing leadership for the whole world at this critical juncture. And I think the last thing I wanted to emphasize is it's actually through this contention that has been kicked open in a beginning way, but needs to go much, much further throughout society. Through this kind of contention over what BA is analyzing and putting forward, that people can get clear on the stakes and they can rise to this occasion. So we want to end by really inviting you to share with us your own thinking on the statement, either in the comments below or writing to us at therevcoms@gmail.com. Share with us what you're running into as you spread it and share it with others, and work with us to make this a major force throughout society and to take up and act on what it is calling for.
So I want to welcome the Reverend Dr. Bob Brashear to the RNL Revolution Nothing Less show. Bob Brashear is the pastor emeritus at the West Park Presbyterian Church in New York City. And Bob was in El Salvador during the War for Liberation in the 1980s. And he continues to go down to Latin America. And he was recently there in this past fall, but in 2019, he happened to be in Santiago, Chile at the time of the uprising that was sparked off by the metro fare hikes. And Bob also works with the International Sanctuary Working Group that's doing work on both the U.S. border, but also on the borders of Southern Europe, where there's a very similar border crisis with the massive refugees coming from the Middle East and Northern and Eastern Africa. So, Bob, welcome to the Revolution Nothing Less show.
It's good to be here, Andy.
Okay. So we've had a whole show on this new statement from Bob Avakian on the crisis that's occasioned by the consolidation of fascism in the context of the upcoming elections. But I wanted to ask you, what resonated for you in this statement?
Okay, I would say there were two or three things that resonated with me, one of which was a very strong sense of clarity as to what the moment calls for. I meet every Wednesday with a group of, I'll say, progressive clergy and other theologically educated people who are committed. And quite frequently we're asking ourselves the question, what is our job? What is it that we're supposed to do? And it's not always clear exactly what you need to do when. And I think one of the things that I really appreciated about the statement is that it brought a very clear and clean critical analysis to the moment and a strong sense of clarity about what we need to do in this moment. I think what also resonated with me is that I've understood for a very long time the concept that because the entire system is one which is really broken, and not only broken, but is needs to be destroyed. I've always understood the idea that anything related to reform, anything less than revolution, is really essentially a waste of time. And what this statement does is say, okay, there's some very particular things we have to do at this moment. That the threat that is posed to humanity at this point is so great that we need to remove this impediment before a real revolution can take place. And I appreciate it as well that coming from Bob Avakian's perspective, that he's doing this out of a real sense of, it's very much in line with other aspects of the Constitution and other writings, where the means does not justify, or the end does not justify the means. And that I've often heard people make the argument of making things better by making things worse. But when you do that, the suffering you impose on innocent people is so great, is that it takes away any benefit from it. So to be very clear about the fact that at this moment in time, the threat that is posed to humanity by the current leadership in this country is so great that it must be removed. And one way to do that is by participating in the election and even voting for Joe Biden. And so to be able to see that as a clear and necessary step towards what can come later is I think, really, really helpful for me and for others.
Well, there's a lot I really appreciate in that, in what you just said. I want to just, for our audience, the Constitution you're referring to is the Constitution for a new socialist republic in North America. That would be the future society of this country after a revolution, that was authored by Bob Avakian. And yes, it's very much the case that how he approaches the question of the elections and the potential for the consolidation of fascism is one of proceeding from the interests of all of humanity and consistent with what's a hallmark of what his work, which is that the means must be consistent with the ends. I want to come back to the relationship between fighting for I want to come back to the question of how we see this related to the process of revolution, but I want to first stay on what you just, the heart of what you just said, that this is an extraordinary situation that we face, and fascism is no joke. You have been in countries that have had fascist regimes. In the past, you've been in countries that were experiencing fascist regimes, and this does require, and what he's fundamentally calling for in this statement is for massive, nonviolent, sustained protests as the key element to drive out this regime before the election, and should the election be contested, to continue that and to bring forward the forces from the people in the streets. But we have to employ every nonviolent means of struggle to remove this regime, which would include, and in this case needs to include, voting should there actually be an election on November 3rd. So I'd like to kind of go a bit more into this question of the acute danger we face right now and how you see that.
I think the danger is visible in what we see and what is present in the news in terms of anyone who is thinking has to look at a situation in Portland where you've got military forces that are totally under the control only of the president, with officers who are and people who got no identification, going around in unmarked vans, taking people off the streets. You have to look at that and realize it for what it is. It took me back to a time a couple years ago when I woke up one morning and said to myself, I live in a country that puts children into cages. I have to accept that I live in a country that puts children into cages. And not too long after that, I was with a friend who was a journalist, and there were pipe bombs in the boxes of so many people around the country, and she said, you have no idea what it's like to work as a journalist when the president of your country declares you to be an enemy of the people. So you have this atmosphere that's been created. Then there's things that we don't even see. Like a week ago, my border friends operate a humanitarian medical facility right inside the U.S.-Mexico border in Arizona, and it's basically staffed by pacifists, doctors, and other medical professionals. And up until a year or so ago, they'd had a pretty decent working relationship with the Border Patrol, where nobody would be bothered as long as they were in the medical facility. Well, last week we had a situation where there were approximately 30 people who had wandered through the most deadly part of the desert, and they were literally attacked by armored personnel carriers and 2 Black Hawk helicopters attacking this medical facility as if it were the Taliban or something. And they wound up immediately deporting people, many of whom had every right to declare asylum, and putting these medical volunteers behind bars. This kind of thing doesn't even make our newspapers, and it's going on a daily basis. And we have to be able to see it for what it is. As I was saying with a friend of mine the other day, obviously, and we know that there are stages and phases of these things, but it really helps me to understand I mean, we always say, well, how could people live in late Weimar Germany and not realize what was going on? I feel a great sense of affinity for those people because we see these things going on every day in the world around us.
Well, I think that's first off, it's unfortunately it's not shocking, but it is shocking what you just explained that it happened on the border just last week. And you're right, it's not in the news media. But I just want to take a second to return to something that you were pointing to in the beginning of our conversation. In a very real sense, that it's not so much that it's not at all that we're suspending revolutionary activity for this period, but living communism, and especially the new communism, is one where you're always analyzing the actual conditions that present to you at any given time. And at this point, a part of, not a diversion from, but a part of fighting for an actual revolutionary movement that could actually lead a revolution that has deep roots among the people, that requires a flexibility in tactics, and it requires that this regime be driven from power, just like every movement for social justice, environmental justice requires that fascism not be consolidated. I know you can testify to the fact that when it is consolidated, then we wouldn't be having this conversation over Zoom. We would be in a very different situation.
Right. Now, what you say is important to me too. As I talk with my youngest son. My youngest son has been very active in the activities surrounding Black Lives Matter, and has been involved in creating a lot of conversations within his family about institutional racism, etc. But the other night, I overheard him talking with a friend of his, and they were both sort of saying, well, Biden, Trump, what's really the difference? It's just like, one's just slightly different than the other. And I think Bob Avakian's analysis here is a good talking point for me to talk to my son about. No, it actually does make a difference. This particular historical moment is an extremely critical moment, and what we do right now has real significance for real people. So yes, of course, getting Biden elected is simply a measure to put something in place so that we can then move forward with what really needs to happen. But you cannot ignore what is happening right now, and the one way to stop that strategically is by participating in this election, fully aware that it's simply a step towards another place, but in this moment, something that needs to be done.
Right, and if it's not accompanied actually by massive protest, it won't actually do that much good, because there's even the possibility, and if not even the likelihood, that Trump may lose by a small margin or whatever margin, and he's going to declare it was a fake, it was a fraud. And then there's going to need to be really serious resistance against the forces that he has mobilized, including within these paramilitary, but also, he had almost, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, bikers up in the Dakotas this last weekend, that there's going to be I'm sorry, go ahead.
Now, my friends in Arizona say that one of the biggest complicating problems the last couple of years have been the thousands of people in camouflage with automatic weapons who've come down to voluntarily help patrol the border. I mean, these kind of forces are out there and they're around. And we don't always see them as we sit here in New York City or other places, but they're out there. And we need to be very, very consciously aware of that, which again speaks to your necessity of organizing large groups of massive protests in order to keep the momentum.
Yeah, and so that is really the point, because if you don't have that, you won't be able to do anything. But here's where the voting actually interacts with that. If people can broadly get a sense that, hey, man, we actually voted and participated and we won this election, now he's trying to take it, that would steal it, that would actually strengthen, and people would see a certain sense of legitimacy in saying, no, he can't do that, whatever legal means he applies, even as Avakian brings out in the statement that a fascist regime on the face of it is illegitimate, and it's been illegitimate from day one, and so these are things we have to get at. So this opens up a bigger conversation. There's things I'd like to talk with you about going forward, and particularly around the role of the role of the progressive church and the role of the evangelical Christian fascist movement, and the struggle within all of that to be able to bring forward the people who of conscience to be a massive force, in defiance and in resistance to what is actually unfolding here. So this is something I'd like to get into in a future episode. Maybe have you back.
I appreciate that because I think it's a really critical conversation and a place where we all need to be focusing our attention. Okay, so I want to thank you for being on the show. It's good to see you again, even if we're doing it through Zoom. And stay well and keep up the work with the International Sanctuary Work Group here and in Southern Europe. So thanks for being on the RNL show. Happy to be here.
Hi, you guys. I'm Jody Sweeten, and I want to read something to you from Refuse Fascism that I think is incredibly important right now. As Trump threatens the elections and sends fascist stormtroopers into cities, build for united nationwide mass protest on Saturday, September 5th, to demand Trump-Pence out now. We are speeding towards an election that Trump is already contesting and now threatens to delay. This election, if there is an election, will be a showdown over the form of rule in this country. Will the Trump-Pence regime hold on to power and be given a mandate to violently suppress dissent and criminalize protest? Will the regime that brands as their enemy all those who struggle for a better world, whether for Black lives or the environment or immigrants' rights, be unleashed to exact revenge aimed at destroying our ability to stand up again? This and worse is unfolding right now, and it has a name: fascism. Now is the time to marshal the people for a determined struggle to demand the Trump-Pence regime out now. All who have been demonized and criminalized by this regime, and the millions who hate Trump and what he stands for, must unite with an unwavering resolve to remove this regime from power the soonest possible time. A fierce battle for our future is underway. The energy that millions of people from many different nationalities, backgrounds, and political beliefs brought to the streets across this country after the horrific murder of George Floyd, and the determination that thousands brought to the streets of Portland to stand strong against Trump's stormtroopers, can and must become the force to remove this hateful regime from power. For more than 3 years, people have relied on the normal channels to stop this regime, only to watch them turn into dead ends. But the months of Black Lives Matter protests show how dread can be transformed into hope. Our power is sustained, mass, nonviolent protest in the streets. Our strength is our diversity. Our demand is for justice. These are the ingredients that have driven out hated regimes and corrupt leaders around the world, from South Korea in 2017 to Armenia in 2018 and to Puerto Rico in 2019. Using voter suppression and gerrymandering, unfounded accusations of voter fraud, mainly by immigrants and Black people, attacks on mail-in ballots, which are completely legal, and a plan to recruit ex-military and police as poll watchers to challenge voters that they deem suspicious. The Trump-Pence regime has shown its determination to maintain a stranglehold on power through legal and extra-legal means. Even talk of canceling or indefinitely postponing the elections is not outside the realm of possibility, as we have seen. Relying on the upcoming elections without a mass struggle now to demand the removal of the regime is a mistake with catastrophic consequences for people in this country and around the world. We cannot wait for the Trump-Pence regime to further delegitimize and degrade the elections. Just as the German people could not have stopped their genocidal fascist program without driving out Hitler and the Nazi regime, we must act with all our resolve to drive this regime out of power. Allowing this 21st century fascist regime led by a demented bully with his finger on the nuclear trigger to consolidate its rule in the most powerful country in the world, is to foreclose on a future for humanity and the planet. There is no painless resolution to this deepening crisis. In the words of the great abolitionist Frederick Douglass, if there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. Power concedes nothing without a demand. And to stop a vicious American fascism that threatens the very future of our humanity, the necessary and unifying demand for every struggle for justice to advance is that Trump Pence out now. This regime has already gone after the most vulnerable while continually expanding the groups of people in its crosshairs. Even if you survive that, what will you be forced to accept in the process? Who will you become as you accept the unacceptable? We have everything to lose if we wait, but everything to gain if we act now to bring millions into the streets refusing to accept a fascist America. There are two futures before us. Which one we get is up to us. In the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America.